A young woman in a quiet Kansas town just completed an old tractor restoration using nothing but grit, determination, and a box of worn-out tools. But what happened next? That old tractor restoration didn't just breathe life into a forgotten machine. It gave her struggling family farm a second chance, brought her community together, and turned despair into hope. This touching story of how one mechanic's daughter restored both an old tractor and her family's future will stay with you long after it ends. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. On the edge of a fading little town in Kansas, where the wheat fields rolled endlessly under restless skies, lived Faith Morgan, a 28-year-old mechanic. Life had carved grit into her hands far earlier than most, each scar and grease stain telling a story of survival. By trade, she fixed engines and patched up farm equipment for neighbors who often paid late or not at all. But by heart, she was her father's daughter, raised on the land, raised to believe that machines like people could be brought back to life if you refused to give up. Faith's father had passed too soon, leaving her not only with memories but also with a failing family farm. The bills piled higher than the wheat. The barn sagged with years of neglect, and the only machine powerful enough to work the land, the old tractor, hadn't rumbled in over a decade. Most folks in town called it junk, another relic destined to rust away behind the barn. Yet Faith couldn't turn her back on it. Every morning, after patching together a few dollars fixing someone else's tools, she'd return home to stare at that silent giant, her mind turning with possibilities. She didn't know it yet, but that broken tractor, abandoned and forgotten, was about to become the lifeline that saved not just her farm, but her family's future. The first time Faith Morgan decided to lay her hands on the tractor, it was a late afternoon in early autumn. The air smelled of burnt leaves, and the horizon glowed orange, stretching across the flat Kansas fields. She wiped the grease off her palms onto her jeans, staring at the hulking machine that had been sitting idle for years in the shadow of the barn. Its paint had faded to a dull, chipped red, its tires cracked, its engine a nest for mice and dust. Neighbors said it wasn't worth the trouble. They told her to sell the farm, cut her losses, move to the city where a mechanic like her could find work. But Faith wasn't ready to surrender. That tractor wasn't just steel and rust. It was her father's voice echoing through time. She could still hear him teaching her as a little girl, "Every machine has a soul. Faith, you just have to listen for it." So she listened. She spent the first evening pulling away weeds that had grown tall around the wheels. Her younger brother, Ethan, only 16, stood nearby watching quietly. He had been growing restless, tired of the weight they carried together. At last he said, "Why bother? Even Dad couldn't fix it before he died." Faith paused, sweat dripping down her temple, and looked at him. "Because it's all we've got left, Ethan. And I'm not letting this farm die while I'm still breathing." The truth was, she didn't know if she could fix it. She had rebuilt engines, patched gearboxes, welded frames, but a tractor this old, this far gone. It was a different beast entirely. Still, she rolled up her sleeves, hauled her toolbox out from the garage, and set to work. The nights grew longer, and the chill set in. Faith spent every free hour she had kneeling in the dirt beside that tractor, stripping the engine apart piece by piece. Sometimes she'd find herself talking to it the way her father once did, muttering encouragements as though the machine might respond. There were setbacks. A piston seized and refused to budge. The fuel lines were eaten through. She replaced the spark plugs, only for the battery to die. Each failure felt like a stone pressing heavier on her chest. Ethan grew more skeptical. "We could sell what's left for scrap," he muttered one night. "Might get enough to keep the lights on for another month." Faith's hands trembled as she held the wrench. "And then what we starve when the farm's gone. No, Ethan, this tractor is the only chance we've got. If I can get it running, maybe we can bring the harvest in. Maybe we can pay off some of the debt." Ethan didn't argue after that, but his silence carried the weight of doubt. Weeks turned into months. The farmhouse kitchen grew colder, bills piled higher, and the cupboards emptier. Yet Faith kept working. Her hands bled from slipping on rusted bolts. Her eyes stung from late nights by the dim light of a lantern. But somewhere deep inside, she believed that if she could just bring this machine back to life, it would bring them back to life too. Then came the night everything changed. It was near midnight, the wind howling across the plains, rattling the barn walls. Faith sat in the driver's seat of the tractor for the first time in years. Her hair stuck to her forehead, her denim jacket was coated in dust and oil, and her fingers ached. But the engine was rebuilt, the fuel lines patched, the wiring redone. For the first time, the tractor looked like it might actually breathe again. Ethan stood outside the barn door, arms crossed, pretending not to care. But she caught the flicker of hope in his eyes. Faith took a deep breath, turned the key, and prayed. At first, nothing. Just the hollow click of the ignition. Her stomach dropped. Then sputter, cough, silence. She tried again. Sputter, grind, a puff of smoke. "Come on," she whispered, as if speaking to her father himself. "Don't leave me now." And then it happened. The engine roared, coughing, growling, then finally finding its voice. The barn shook with the sound, a sound so familiar it made her eyes sting with tears. Ethan's jaw dropped, his arms falling to his sides. Faith laughed through her tears, gripping the wheel. The old tractor was alive. She didn't know it yet, but that moment the sound of steel and fire waking from the dead was more than just victory. It was the turning point. Because that machine wasn't just going to work the land, it was going to save the farm. The tractor's roar echoed through the hollow barn like a ghost come back to life. Faith sat frozen in the driver's seat, her fingers gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles whitened. She had done it. Against every whisper of doubt, every skeptical look from Ethan, every sleepless night filled with fear, she had brought it back. Ethan laughed out loud for the first time in weeks, running a hand through his shaggy hair. "I can't believe it," he shouted over the engine's growl. "You actually did it, Faith." For a moment, hope filled the air like oxygen after drowning. Faith climbed down from the seat, wiping grease across her jeans, and hugged her brother tightly. They were laughing, crying, holding on to each other in the glow of the lantern light. For that brief night, it felt as though the weight of the world had lifted. But the morning brought a new reality. The next day, word spread quickly in Maple Hollow. People in small towns always had a way of knowing everything. By noon, 2 neighbors stopped by not to congratulate her, but to remind her of what she was up against. "Even if you get that tractor working, Mr. Wallace," an older farmer with lines etched deep into his face, said, "You don't have enough seed. Faith, no money for fertilizer. And the harvest window is closing. A machine can't solve everything." Faith bit her tongue, thanking him politely, but inside she felt her stomach sink. He was right. The tractor was alive, but the farm itself was still hanging by a thread. 2 days later, something worse happened. Faith had been testing the tractor in the field, the engine steady and strong, when a sheriff's truck pulled into the driveway. Sheriff Donnelly, a broad man with a heavy walk, stepped out carrying a thick envelope. His eyes softened when he saw Faith. "I'm sorry." "Faith, he said, holding it out. Banks moving forward with foreclosure. 30 days. Her breath caught in her chest. 30 days to save the farm. 30 days to pay off debts she had no idea how to cover. Ethan cursed under his breath, storming off toward the barn. That night, as rain pelted the tin roof of their farmhouse. Faith sat at the kitchen table staring at the letter. She pressed her hands into her face, fighting back tears. She had thought fixing the tractor would be enough, that her father's voice had guided her to salvation. Instead, it felt like she had only woken up to a harsher truth: the machine was alive, but it couldn't fix everything. Then came the knock. It was near midnight, the storm outside still raging. Faith opened the door to see Mr. Alvarez, their old neighbor, standing in the rain. He was a widower who'd known her father well. His hat dripped water down his lined face, and his eyes were kind but urgent. "I heard the tractor running," he said. "Didn't think I'd ever hear that sound again." Faith nodded, too exhausted to speak. Alvarez stepped closer. "Listen, I can't pay you in money, but I've got something else. I've got seed, good wheat seed, just sitting in my shed. Take it. Plant it. Don't let this farm die." Faith stared at him, stunned. "Why would you do that?" He smiled faintly. "Because your daddy once fixed my harvester in the middle of the night. Wouldn't take a dime for it. Said neighbors help neighbors. Guess it's my turn." Faith's throat tightened. She took the seed, hugging the old man with tears streaming down her face. It wasn't enough to solve everything, but it was something. The next morning, she and Ethan worked from dawn until dusk, planting the borrowed seed with the revived tractor. The machine rumbled faithfully across the fields, cutting neat rows into soil that had lain silent for too long. For the first time in years, the land looked alive. But just when hope began to bloom, another twist came. As Faith guided the tractor across the last stretch of field, smoke began to pour from the engine. She slammed the brakes, leapt down, and saw oil leaking fast from a cracked line. The machine she had rebuilt with her bare hands was breaking again right when she needed it most. Faith dropped to her knees in the mud, rain dripping off her hair, her fists pounding the earth. Ethan rushed to her side, but she waved him off, eyes blazing. "No," she said through gritted teeth. "Not this time. This tractor is going to run. I don't care what it takes." She didn't know it yet, but the coming days would test her harder than anything before. Because saving the tractor wasn't just about machinery anymore. It was about saving her family's farm, and perhaps saving herself. The rain had soaked her to the bone, but Faith Morgan refused to leave the tractor. She sat in the mud, oil-stained hands trembling as the storm raged above. All those nights, all those sacrifices, was it really for nothing? Ethan crouched beside her, his voice soft. "Faith, maybe Wallace was right. Maybe it's too much for just us." Faith clenched her jaw, fighting the despair rising inside her. She had always believed she had to carry the weight alone, that strength meant never asking for help. But in that moment, as thunder rolled across the sky, she realized something her father used to say had been echoing in her ears for weeks, without her hearing it clearly. A farm isn't run by one pair of hands. It takes a community, faith. The next morning, swollen-eyed but unbroken, she made a decision. Instead of hiding her struggle, she walked straight into the heart of Maple Hollow. She stopped at the diner where farmers gathered before dawn, their coffee cups steaming, their boots muddy from chores. Conversations hushed as she stepped inside, grease still under her fingernails, her clothes worn thin. "I need help," she said simply. her voice steady though her heart pounded. "The tractor's alive, but it won't last. The bank gave us 30 days. I can't do this alone, but if the fields are planted, we have a chance. Not just for me, for the farm my daddy built, the land that fed this town for years." For a long moment, no one spoke. Mr. Wallace, the skeptic, shook his head slowly. "Faith, folks are barely making it themselves." But then Mrs. Thompson, a widow who had lost her farm years earlier, spoke up. "Her daddy gave me hay when my cattle were starving one winter. Didn't ask for a thing. If Faith says she needs us, I say we help." A murmur rippled through the room. Another man nodded, then another. Before long, hands were raised, voices rising with quiet resolve. That afternoon, neighbors began to arrive. Some brought tools, others spare parts. Alvarez returned with more seed. Kids ran between rows, carrying water. Ethan, seeing the town rally behind his sister, looked at her with something he hadn't shown in months: faith in her, faith in them. Faith's perspective shifted with every gesture of kindness. She had thought the tractor would save the farm, but now she understood it was people, their willingness to stand together. That gave life to the soil. Over the next week, the tractor was repaired again, this time not by Faith alone, but with the steady hands of half the town. Men who had worked machines longer than she'd been alive showed her tricks her father never had time to teach. Teenagers learned by watching, inspired by her determination. Even Wallace showed up one morning, silently handing her a new oil line. The fields began to fill with neat rows of planted seed. The sound of the tractor cutting across the land was joined by laughter, shouts, and the clatter of tools. The farm, once silent and dying, buzzed with life again. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky gold, Faith stood at the edge of the field. Ethan came to stand beside her, his arms folded. "You know," he said quietly, "I thought you were crazy, trying to do this by yourself, but seeing everyone out here, I get it now." Faith smiled faintly, tears burning her eyes. "I thought fixing the tractor was the answer. But it was never just about that. Dad was right. It takes more than one pair of hands." For the first time in months, she felt something she hadn't dared to believe in: hope that was bigger than herself. But even as hope grew, so did the challenge. The 30-day deadline still loomed. The bank's foreclosure letter still sat on the kitchen table, and as the crops sprouted in fragile green shoots, Faith knew the hardest part wasn't over. Still, her perspective had changed forever. She no longer saw herself as a lone mechanic fighting a losing battle. She saw herself as part of something greater, a community bound together by sweat, soil, and a belief that no farm, no family, should stand alone. The days passed in a blur of sweat and soil. The tractor rattled across the fields each morning, the steady thrum of its engine like a heartbeat, bringing the land back to life. Faith Morgan, once convinced she had to shoulder the burden alone, now found herself surrounded by neighbors who worked beside her, as if the farm belonged to all of them. Still, every night when the lanterns dimmed and the helpers went home, the letter from the bank glared at her from the kitchen table. 30 days, 25, 20. The numbers ticked down like a clock she couldn't escape. One evening, just as she was packing up her tools, Ethan came running from the mailbox, waving an envelope. "Faith, you need to see this." His voice cracked with excitement. She frowned, wiping grease from her hands as she tore it open. Inside was a flyer, an announcement for the Maple Hollow Harvest Fair, an annual event she hadn't thought about in years. It was usually a small gathering with rides, contests, and pies, But this year, something was different. There was going to be a statewide restoration showcase, sponsored by an agricultural magazine. Cash prizes would be awarded to the best restored farm equipment. Faith's heart skipped. The tractor. She could already see the possibility flickering on the horizon. If she entered the tractor, if the judges could see how far it had come from rusted ruin to roaring life, maybe they'd take notice. Maybe she could win enough prize money to pay off the most urgent debts, or at least buy them time. But almost as soon as the thought came, the doubt followed. The flyer said the competition would be tough collectors, professional restorers, people who had been working on antique tractors their whole lives. Faith was just a struggling mechanic with a patched-together machine. What chance did she have against them? That night, she sat on the porch, staring out at the starlit fields. Ethan leaned against the railing beside her. "You're thinking about the fair, aren't you?" She sighed. "It's crazy. The tractor's running. But it's not perfect. Those guys, they'll bring machines polished to shine like they've never seen a day of work. Ours still rattles. Still leaks a little." Ethan tilted his head. "Yeah, but none of those tractors have a story like ours." Faith turned to him, surprised. He continued, his voice firm for once. "You didn't just restore a machine. You brought back a farm. You gave this whole town something to fight for. That tractor isn't just metal. Faith, it's proof of what we can do when we don't give up." His words sank deep. She had been so focused on whether the machine was good enough that she forgot what it stood for. The next morning, Faith told the town about her idea. There were raised eyebrows, chuckles, even doubts. But slowly, the same people who had rallied to plant the fields rallied again, this time to polish, paint, and prepare the tractor not just as a tool, but as a symbol. The barn turned into a workshop, buzzing with energy. Mrs. Thompson stitched a banner with the farm's name. Alvarez donated a set of fresh tires he had been saving. Teenagers sanded rust from the fenders, while Ethan painted careful strokes of bright red along the hood. For the first time, the tractor didn't just look alive, it looked proud. When the day of the harvest fair arrived, Faith drove the tractor down Main Street, its engine steady, its new coat gleaming under the autumn sun. People turned their heads, pointing and smiling. Some clapped, others tipped their hats. By the time she reached the fairgrounds, a small crowd had gathered behind her, following like a parade. Faith swallowed her nerves as she lined up beside tractors that looked like they had been built yesterday. Shiny chrome, spotless engines, flawless details. Her stomach twisted, but Ethan nudged her. "Don't look at them. Just remember why you're here." When the judges came by, Faith stood tall, grease still staining her nails, her denim jacket worn thin. She didn't hide the imperfections, she told the story. She spoke about her father, about the farm, about the nights she nearly gave up, and about the neighbors who refused to let the land die. She explained that this tractor wasn't restored to sit in a showroom. It was restored to save a life, a home, a community. By the time she finished, there were tears in the eyes of people gathered around. Even the judges were silent for a moment before nodding with respect. Faith didn't know yet if she would win. But as she stood there, with Ethan smiling at her side and the town gathered behind her, she realized something this tractor had already given her more than she could have dreamed. It had given her a new opportunity, not just to save the farm, but to believe that miracles could come from the unlikeliest places, even from the rusted bones of a forgotten machine. When the judges moved on, Faith Morgan let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The fairgrounds buzzed with noise, children laughing, fiddles playing, the smell of roasted corn drifting through the air but inside her chest. Silence pressed heavy. She had poured her heart out, and now all she could do was wait. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan tugged at her sleeve. "Come on, Faith, let's look around. Distract yourself." They wandered past pie-eating contests, hay bale tosses, and booths selling homemade jam. Faith smiled politely at neighbors who clapped her on the back, but her mind kept circling back to the judges' clipboards. Every so often, she glanced at the tractor gleaming in the sunlight, its new coat of red shining like it had been waiting years for this day. Then came the announcement. The crowd gathered near the stage, the judges holding envelopes. Faith's stomach clenched as the announcer's booming voice filled the fairgrounds. Third place was awarded to a collector from Wichita, his tractor spotless as glass. Second place went to a man with a gleaming John Deere that looked more sculpture than machine. And first place, the announcer declared, goes to... Faith's heart thudded so hard she could barely hear. Faith Morgan, with the Hayes family farm tractor. For a moment, she thought she'd misheard. Ethan whooped so loud the whole fair turned. Hands clapped her shoulders, voices cheered. And before she knew it, she was on stage, blinking in disbelief as the judges handed her a ribbon and a check big enough to take her breath away. The announcer leaned close, microphone catching every word. "Faith, your tractor isn't the shiniest, but it's alive. And your story, it reminded us all why these machines matter. They carry history, family, survival. You didn't just restore steel, you restored hope." Tears blurred Faith's vision as the crowd erupted in applause. For the first time in years, she felt seen not just as the mechanic struggling to save a dying farm, but as someone who had built something worth honoring. But growth isn't born in moments of triumph alone. It comes in what follows. The prize money helped. She paid down the most urgent debts, buying herself time. Yet the farm was still fragile. Bills remained, and crops had only just begun to sprout. The battle wasn't over, but instead of collapsing under the weight, Faith felt something new growing inside her, a quiet confidence. In the weeks that followed, she began to change in small ways. She no longer hid her struggles. When neighbors stopped by, she welcomed them with open hands instead of guarded pride. She shared meals, even if they were simple, and asked questions about their own farms. For the first time, she let herself believe she didn't have to do everything alone. One evening, she sat on the porch with Ethan watching the field sway in the wind. The wheat shoots glimmered pale green in the fading light. "You know," Ethan said softly, "I used to hate this farm. Thought it was a trap. But seeing what you've done, I think maybe it's home after all." Faith turned to him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. He shrugged, but she saw his eyes glisten. The boy who once doubted her had become her greatest ally. And then, something unexpected happened. The story of the girl mechanic who saved her farm spread beyond Maple Hollow. A local newspaper ran a piece on her. Then a regional magazine picked it up. Strangers began driving out just to see the tractor that had come back from the dead. Some offered donations. Others simply came to shake her hand. Faith had spent her whole life believing she was just one woman in a small town, destined to struggle in silence. But now, she saw it differently. Her battle, her grit, her refusal to quit it resonated with people. She wasn't invisible anymore. One night, as the crickets sang and the stars scattered across the Kansas sky, Faith stood alone in the barn, hand resting on the tractor's warm hood. She whispered into the quiet, as if her father were listening. "I thought saving this machine would save the farm, but maybe it saved me too." She smiled through her tears, no longer afraid of the road ahead. For the first time, Faith Morgan didn't just see herself as a struggling mechanic. She saw herself as something greater, a fighter, a leader, and a keeper of her family's legacy. And deep down, she knew whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready. Autumn rolled into winter, and the Kansas winds cut sharper across the fields. The wheat shoots were fragile but alive, swaying bravely against the cold. Every morning, Faith Morgan bundled up, slid into the tractor seat, and guided the machine across the fields with steady hands. The farm wasn't saved overnight, but day by day, row by row, hope grew. The prize money from the harvest fair kept the bank at bay, but what truly carried Faith forward wasn't the check, it was the community. Neighbors dropped off jars of canned vegetables, brought over spare parts, and even sent their kids to help with chores. Strangers, too, began to visit. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they had heard about the mechanic who saved her farm with an old tractor. Faith never thought she would be anyone's inspiration. She still saw herself as the girl with grease-stained hands and bills stacked on the counter. But when she looked out and saw children climbing onto the tractor for pictures, or older farmers nodding at her with quiet respect, she realized something had shifted. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was carrying a story bigger than herself. One crisp December evening, as the first snow began to dust the barn roof, a town gathering was held at the community hall. The place was packed, lit with strings of old Christmas lights, the air thick with the smell of chili and cornbread. Faith hadn't wanted to go. She was tired, worn, and unsure what she could offer. But Ethan insisted. When she arrived, conversations hushed. The mayor stepped forward and held up his hand. "Tonight," he said, "we honor one of our own, a young woman who reminded us all that this town doesn't survive on machines or money. It survives on grit, kindness, and the refusal to quit. Faith Morgan. Would you come up here?" Faith froze. Her cheeks flushed as people clapped, urging her forward. Ethan nudged her, grinning. With hesitant steps, she climbed onto the small stage. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone. Dozens of faces looked back at her, faces she had known all her life, and faces she'd never seen before. "I don't know what to say," she began softly. "When my daddy died, I thought I had to carry everything alone. I thought strength meant never asking for help. But I was wrong. Fixing that tractor, it gave me back more than a machine. It gave me back this community. It gave me back my family. And it showed me that sometimes being strong means admitting you can't do it by yourself." Her voice cracked, and for a moment she had to stop, swallowing the lump in her throat. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She continued, her words steady now. "This farm isn't saved yet, not completely, but I believe it will be. Not because of me, but because of us. Because when we stand together, we can bring life back to what was once broken. Machines, land, even people." The hall was silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy. Then, slowly, applause rose, soft at first, then thunderous. Some people stood, others wiped tears from their eyes. In that moment, Faith felt her father's presence more than ever. She imagined him standing at the back of the hall, arms crossed, nodding with quiet pride. When the evening ended, Faith stepped outside into the falling snow. The fields stretched before her, blanketed in white, waiting for spring. She pulled her jacket tighter, breath clouding in the frosty air. Ethan walked beside her, and for the first time, she saw the same determination burning in his eyes that had once lived only in hers. As the tractor sat gleaming under the barn lights, Faith whispered to herself, "We're going to make it, one season at a time. The old machine had carried more than seed across the soil. It had carried her through grief, fear, and doubt, and brought her to a place of courage and hope. And though she didn't know what the future held, Faith Morgan knew the farm would stand. Her family would endure, and the story of a young mechanic and her father's tractor would be told long after the last harvest was gathered. Because sometimes, saving a machine means saving so much more. Anyone can restore what's broken if they're willing to work hard enough, and believe deep enough. As the first green blades pushed through the Kansas soil, Faith Morgan stood by the old tractor that once sat rusting in silence. She didn't open a ledger or a foreclosure notice that night. She opened a notebook to sketch out a plan, not just for her farm, but for every struggling family who thought their story was over. She knew now the dream she fought for wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to every farmer who had ever been told to sell, every small-town dreamer who thought they had no chance, and every person who had ever been underestimated. The young mechanic who once cried in the mud beside a broken machine had become the woman who would keep her family, her land, and her community alive. Because for Faith and for those who followed the farm was never just about crops. It was about hope, and hope, once planted, always grows. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories waiting for you. Click to keep believing with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some things are worth fighting for.